Hey guys, how are y'all doing tonight? I hope y'all have been enjoying getting to know my friends from West Coast over the past few weeks, but for tonight, you're kind of stuck with me again, so I'm sorry. But tonight, we're going to just jump right in on our third lesson here in the series that y'all been going through called Stand Tall, and we're going to talk about this idea of determination. And determination is a pretty cool word. So some synonyms that kind of would like describe determination, like in my opinion, would kind of be like perseverance or a resolve or maybe even like steadfastness. And those are all pretty great synonyms. But a better way to almost define determination would, I would probably say it like it's a consistent alignment of your ability and your action, and then it also lines up with your belief. Like, I guess we could say it like this: if I am a determined person, then I do, or our action, everything I can do, which is our ability, and because of what I believe to be true, which is our belief. And I stand firm and resolute in that stance. Now, determination inside of a Jesus follower or a Christian, right, can be the difference between the person who honors God by standing tall and the one who just kind of gives up, right? That's what kind of determination will do. Tonight, we're going to see how to develop a determination that displays divine trust. That's going to be our statement of tonight. And we're going to jump in here in Daniel chapter number 3. Daniel chapter number 3, the story we're going to talk about is pretty common. We kind of probably have all heard this story before, but we're going to talk about this story and how it kind of relates to this word determination and how it's going to impact our own lives if we live understanding this idea of determination. So Daniel chapter 3, and the story kind of goes along all through chapter 3. So we're not going to read the entire chapter, but if y'all have time on your own free time, go ahead. I would encourage you to kind of read this entire chapter through, because we're not going to touch every single verse tonight. But tonight we're going to talk about 3 different Hebrew men who were in Babylon. And this is going to be a pretty common story, but it's going to be about these 3 men named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And once I say those names, you probably already know where we're going with this. But we're going to look at these 3 men, and we're going to look at some ways in which we can also display our determination to trust and honor God with our lives. So let's gain some inspiration for our lives from the example of these determined men. So firstly here, number 1, this story will teach us to follow God in all of our circumstances. So let's kind of begin here with kind of the backstory of where we're about to go. So these 3 men were taken captive by this king called Nebuchadnezzar, and they were trapped in a foreign land that they've never been to before, and they were pretty scared at first, right? I probably would be too, honestly. King Nebuchadnezzar had created this huge golden statue, and he kind of wanted every single person in the entire nation of Babylon to worship this golden statue. And once this statue was completed, the king placed it in the middle of the entire city in a very open place where everyone around could see it. Like if you walked like anywhere close to it, like probably not even close to it, if you walked anywhere in the city, you probably would be able to tell that there's a big golden statue there. So he instructed then everyone to come to a dedication service to this statue. And so there's like this big gathering just so people could like acknowledge that there was a big golden statue in the middle of the city, basically is what was going on. And at this dedication, King Nebuchadnezzar had announced that everyone was going to be required to bow down to it. He wanted everyone to worship this golden image that he had created. And he wanted everyone to do it so much that they even gave every single person a cue on when to bow down. So like no one could miss it. No one could be like, oh, I didn't know that we were supposed to do it now. Like there was going to be no excuse. When it says that when music was played, so they were going to play music, and when the music played, then everyone was required to bow down and worship this golden idol. And then another insurance that King Nebuchadnezzar made was that if you didn't bow down to this idol, then you are about to be cast into a fiery furnace where you would definitely die, a pretty gruesome death. Like I would hate to be killed and murdered by fire and a massive fireplace, right? That would be pretty terrible. So he certainly made his point very clear, and everyone did what they were told to. Well, everyone, that is, except for these three men that we're going to talk about, who were determined to stand for what is right. So we're going to look here real quick and read verses number, I think, 8. Yeah, we're going to start in 8 and 9 and read verse 12 as well. So it says, "Wherefore at that time certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. They spake and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever." And then verse number 12 it says, "There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." So basically, some people kind of ratted out Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? They were like, "Hey king, these guys over here, they didn't do what you asked them to do. They should get in trouble." The Bible makes it clear here that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were kind of like, had some high jobs here in the city of Babylon. And it says they were administrators. And so based on their character and the wording of this passage, it's pretty clear that these three men kind of basically made a determined decision to stand tall, to stand against what the king was saying. They were determined to live out their faith. It's one thing to say what you believe, but it's another thing to use your ability and act on what you believe. Their belief was they knew that their idolatry was a sin against God. Their ability was that they could either stand or they could bow. And their action was they refused to commit adultery. They stood tall and were determined to not do this thing that they knew would disobey God. And their decision wasn't made based on immediate circumstances. They were captives in a foreign country far away from anyone who would care if they would bow down. Like, it would be really easy to just bow down right then and there because no one knew who they were. No one really cared that they were Jews. No one cared that they worshiped God. So it would have been super easy to just bow down right then and there, and no one would have thought anything different. But they knew that it would be wrong. They knew that it would defy God. So this kind of shows us, again, that we need to develop a determination that displays divine trust. And then that will lead us into our second lesson here from these three men, which is trust God no matter the consequences. So if we go back to their story, the king was super mad. The king got really mad that these three men did not bow down to his idol. I don't know why King Nebuchadnezzar was so for these people bowing down to his idol, but he was, and he got really mad that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't. At this point, they were brought before the king, and the king was like, "Hey, I'm going to give you a second chance because y'all are kind of important here. You're not going to be easily replaceable, so we're going to let you have a second chance." And now at this point, there's nowhere to hide for these three men. For Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their choice is now 100% defined. They can't just fake bowing down at this point. They're in the middle. They're standing right before the king and some of the king's highest men. And so they just basically had to go for it at this point. They had to be determined to either stand tall or 100% bow down. There was no middle ground this time. So it would be understandable if someone chose to conform to what they were being asked to do, right? Like, it would be pretty terrifying to be standing in front of the king and being like, hey, if you don't bow down right now, there's going to be some serious consequences. Like, you're going to die if you don't bow down to me right now, or bow down to this golden image. But they were determined to do what was right. And so they stood tall. And then as we read again in verse number 16 of Daniel chapter 3. Actually read verse 17 just for time. And it says, "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." So it's very clear right here, right, that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were 100% determined that they were not going to disobey God and worship this golden image. In fact, in the face of a fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego made it clear that they would not serve the king or his gods or worship this golden image. They believed that God could deliver them. Belief is a choice to trust in God. They could either stand or bow, which would be their ability, like we said earlier. But they refused to commit adultery, which was their action. So follow God in all of our circumstances. And then we also have to trust God, no matter what the consequences would be. Like, they literally stood for God even though they knew the consequence was going to be death. But then thirdly, we have to accept God's way of deliverance. Now, it's pretty easy to kind of trust God when you know what the outcome is going to be, right? But then sometimes it's really hard to trust God when it's something different than we might think. If we continue on this story, it's going to talk about how they actually did get thrown into the fiery furnace. God didn't miraculously save them right then and there. And then if we look at the verses we just read, in verse number 18, these words literally came out of their mouths. It says, "But if not." So they're basically saying, hey, king, so we know that our God is going to deliver us. But they didn't just stop there. They weren't basically like, hey, we know God's going to deliver us, so we're not going to bow down to you. No, they said, hey, we know that our God can deliver us, but he might not. So either way, we're good with standing tall against you and living for our own God. They knew that there was a possibility that they were going to die right then and there. They knew that there is a but if not, that God has his own divine will and that his will is greater than their own, even if they didn't understand it. Like, why in the world would God kind of wait till after they got thrown in the fiery furnace, right? That kind of seems pretty interesting. But we need to be like that. We need to understand, like, hey, we might go through something that's like pretty tough, and then we don't have to expect that God's going to just immediately deliver us from that, because we don't know what God thinks, and God's will is always going to be greater than ours. Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they got like held by these people and were like about to get thrown in the fiery furnace, they're like, well, this might be the end. Like, we're gonna die. Like, they weren't expecting to just like get thrown into the fiery furnace and then survive, right? But that's sometimes what happens to us in life. Like, we kind of get thrown into a storm, we get thrown into this this thing that we didn't necessarily want, but then it works out for God's good. And if we keep like reading and going through this life of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, God's power is going to be shown, right? Because that they believed that God would or would not save them and were willing to get thrown into that fiery furnace, God's power was shown even more. And so if we keep looking in verse number 26 of Daniel chapter 23, It says, Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of a burning fiery furnace, and spake, and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth, and come hither. So basically, right there, and right then and there, King Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges that the God that these three Hebrew men serve was higher than any other god. He recognized and called them servants of the Most High God. That's pretty cool, right? And in this, you can see God's bigger plans revealed. We've seen that we need to follow God, we need to trust God and see Him deliver us. But then there's one last thing that we need to kind of go over here. And that is number 4, glorify God for His power. It would have been pretty easy to kind of just be like, oh yeah, King Nebuchadnezzar, we did it. We got out of the fiery furnace and kind of like just take all that glory for ourselves, right? Because Nebuchadnezzar had never ever experienced anything like what he had just seen. So he made a proclamation. And in verse number 28 here in Daniel chapter 3, it says, Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel, and delivered his servants that trusted him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree, that every people, nation, language which spake anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their house shall be made a dunghill, because there is no God that can deliver after this sort. The king praised God, and how he did it is very interesting. First, King Nebuchadnezzar recognized that God had delivered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He acknowledged that the king's own men died trying to put them in the fire furnace, and no one should have survived that after the fact, right? Like, their king's servants and guards literally died on their way to the fire furnace. They didn't even go inside, but they died literally right on the outside. So that's pretty crazy. If he went inside, there's no reason that they should have lived. He acknowledged that, and then realized that this was none other than the God who spared their lives in a miraculous way, the God that was above every other God. Second, he acknowledged that these 3 young men were right for disobeying him, that they did the right thing, which sounds kind of crazy for a king to admit, right? He made this rule and made this law, but he realized, hey, this law was stupid. I shouldn't have done this, and these guys were actually right for doing what they did. They chose to follow God, and although there was a price to pay, God saved them from certain death. It's always better to follow God and do right than to follow a culture and disobey God. And then third, Nebuchadnezzar made a law that no one in all of Babylon could talk badly about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God. There's if they talked bad, if they talked negatively, if they gossiped about the almighty, all-powerful God, then they'd be chopped up in pieces, and their houses and lands would be destroyed, and their property would just be absolutely messed up. And the king's reasoning was that God was superior to any of the Babylonian gods, because no one else could have saved these 3 men from that certain death. God really showed his power to Nebuchadnezzar, and the king gave glory to God in return. God's power is unmatched, and he alone deserves the glory for it. There's going to be times in our life when, especially when we walk with Jesus, that things are going to be difficult. Perhaps your friends are, maybe some friends are going to stop liking you because you never want to do something that they want to do, because you believe that it's wrong and you stand against that. Or maybe you won't be able to date someone because they kind of believe something completely different than you do and want you to get involved in something that you know you shouldn't do. Can you trust him if that means losing friendships? Can you trust him if following him means people won't invite you to certain activities? Is God more important than your friendships? Or is God more important than how people think of you? So how about it? Will you be determined to follow God today? Will you be determined to follow him no matter what the cost or what the consequences of that might be? Will you align what you can do with what you believe to be true about God and then actually do it? Will you work to develop a determination that displays divine trust in every aspect of our life? If so, this is a huge step of faith, but God can be trusted. If you have a decision to make tonight, will you stand firm against the sins of this world, or will you fall to them? You have this choice tonight. What are you going to do about it?